House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has heightened the pressure on moderate House Democrats who said they want to vote on the bipartisan infrastructure bill before the $3.5 trillion budget resolution. Pelosi responded saying, quote, any delay in passing the budget resolution could threaten our ability to pass this essential legislation through reconciliation. Here to weigh in is co-host of the Bad Faith podcast and former National Press Secretary for the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, Briahna Joy Gray. She joins us now to discuss. Briahna, it looks like Pelosi is going to force the vote on the budget resolution. Is it disorienting watching this kind of allegiance between the House Speaker and progressives in the House play out, arrayed against the corporate Democratic wing?
I mean, yeah, we'll see what happens. Most certainly, I think what this does is really confirm that the logic behind force the vote was accurate, right? And you don't need force the vote to prove that to you, and you don't need this instance to prove it to you either. Corporate Dems, conservative members of our party, have consistently and always threatened not to pass legislation in order to get what they wanted, whether it was salt tax deductions or other kinds of conservative policies that are broadly out of line with their constituents, what voters actually want. Now, in this instance, finally, it seems that the bifurcated nature of this bill means that you have two camps set up, right? You have I don't even want to call them progressives. I would call them Democrats who are doing their job, who are fighting for what overwhelming majorities of Americans want, all these incredibly popular policies that are in this reconciliation bill, right? The stuff that they couldn't get into the bipartisan bill because of Republicans and corporate Democrats. And at the same time, there are a bunch of corporatists that are really invested primarily in the bipartisan bill, including Joe Biden, who has articulated time and time again how invested he is in that particular bit of legislation. And now there's a bit of a game of chicken where the conservatives in the Democratic Party are agitating now to say, okay, I want to vote for the bipartisan bill first, as though that's not a clear signal that they are looking for an excuse to get out of voting for the more progressive reconciliation package that progressives in the caucus are invested in which millions of Americans are depending on. Now, the question is, I think still, why the effort to bifurcate these bills instead of putting them together? So this jockeying act around which is voted for first isn't the be-all, end-all as to what gets passed. And I think we have a long way to go to actually seeing whether House leadership will genuinely fight, and be willing to take all of this legislation that so many people are so invested in order to make sure that both the bipartisan and the reconciliation bill actually get through.
Briahna, let me ask you, so obviously everyone's eyes are on the midterms 2022, and the common wisdom, though I never buy common wisdom, is the Democrats are going to lose the House, Republicans are going to take back some seats. But what are your thoughts on advancing something like this that is, yes, very popular with progressives, but less so in moderate districts that are, D+1 or R+1 even, that Democrats need to hold the House? To you, is it more important that they pass this massive bill than it is that they keep their majority in the House?
Well, I would challenge a couple of framing issues there. One, this bill, while it might be massive in the scale of the lack of spending that our American government has done to provide basic needs for our country in recent political history, it's not actually massive as compared to the original $6 trillion bill, which I would argue is what was actually needed, given that we were in the largest economic and health crisis in a century. And secondly, I would push back against the idea that the components of this bill, if we're talking about it in real terms instead of just in political terms, are actually extremely popular in red districts. And what enables Republicans and conservative Democrats to pitch one bill as the conservative bill and one bill as the progressive throwaway bill is the fact that they have been bifurcated in this way and are spoken about like they're cars on a racetrack, instead of talking about all the benefits that are in the reconciliation bill. America is one of the only, if not the only country, a developed country that doesn't have child care, things like home hospice care, expanding Medicare to cover hearing, vision, and dental. These are all things that are considered to be human rights and a complete given in any other similarly situated country in the world. And I think that anybody who was interested in the horizon of winning in midterms should be talking very specifically and at length in all districts, whether they're red or blue, about the extent to which the Americans deserve, at bare minimum, the things that other countries get on a good day, and especially in the context of this enormous crisis, economic crisis, that millions of Americans are still struggling with. They especially deserve for their government to actually do something for them in exchange for keeping the country on its wheels through all of this.
Briahna, this bill includes a lot of, it's pretty wide reaching. So it includes not only all of those things that you mentioned that I think American families absolutely want, but also climate and immigration. So when Nancy Pelosi, when she goes and says, okay, these bills are stuck together and we're going to do it this way, and she clearly will have to negotiate with the moderate Democrats and maybe some Republicans, what do you think she's going to trim?
Well, she can try to trim climate stuff, but the progressives have specifically said, the squad members have specifically said that keeping what climate legislation is in these bills is a priority. Now, we just did an episode on Bad Faith podcast that came out on Monday with two climate experts, a NASA scientist and a meteorologist and journalist, who, didn't pull any punches about the extent to which that what is provided in these infrastructure bills is far, far, far too insufficient to really address the enormous climate concerns that are raised broadly, but specifically in this IPCC report that just came out last week. So it would be, I think, particularly a kick in the gut for progressives and a real demonstration that there's very little, it's pretty futile to work within the party structure on such important issues if Nancy Pelosi were to try to strip out any of those priorities. Right. But it looks like one of the biggest tension points is going to be this idea of pay for and raising taxes. Now, the MMT people don't come for me. Of course, that's not how, you don't have to have specific line item pay fors when you're talking about the federal government. However, there is the feeling that we might have to raise taxes on the very rich in order to pull some money out of the economy so that they don't sit on it in banks and there's the kind of spending that resists some inflationary pressures, et cetera. And there's been a lot of pushback about that particular aspect of the bill, the funding piece. And I think that climate in some of those areas is a really useful stalking horse for conservatives who want to assure their base of affluent voters that they're not going to have to pay any more into the country that, again, is barely getting by at this point, given the crisis that we just came out of in the last year.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because the structure of the Democratic coalition has changed since they took the House in 2006, rather than relying on conservative rural areas to make up the gap in their majority. They now have these suburban districts, some of which are wealthier and might resist some of those tax hikes. But at the same time, those voters are totally fine and actually quite supportive of immigration reform and all of the climate stuff that you talked about. And some of them are okay with tax hikes, even if it hits them a little bit. So we'll see. But speaking of 2006 Democrats, West Virginia activists launched the website replacejoemanchin.com on Tuesday morning to raise money and encourage West Virginians to nominate people in their communities to run for office in an effort to, quote, oust the conservative Democrat. Briahna, this is reported by our former colleague Aida Chavez in the Nation. Do you think that there's enough progressive energy in West Virginia that they could put pressure on Joe Manchin to keep him in line long enough to support both of these packages?
Yeah, look, I think that there's enough progressive energy anywhere in this country to do anything progressives want to do if they put their minds to it. The question is whether or not this organization or any other organization is going to be effective in leveraging that energy. There's a lot that's left on the table, in my view, with respect to messaging, for instance, when it comes to these fights. Are we going to call Joe Manchin a conservative Democrat, a term that might be, balm to the ear of certain West Virginians that consider themselves conservative in terms of their values and, kind of personal values? Or are we going to call him a corporate Democrat, a Democrat that would sell his constituents out for all of the corporate benefits and payouts that he's been receiving over the course of his career. A Democrat who seems to have set up his daughter, a pharmaceutical czar of sorts, and put her interests and the interests of pharmaceutical companies over the members of his state, the inhabitants of his state, who are devastated by the opioid crisis in a way that is pretty unmatched across the country. And if the people in West Virginia are able to tee up those issues and not get distracted with some of the language that gets used in kind of high-level partisan media context, then I think that they could go a really long way. But here's the other thing. So often these efforts are raised in the context of a particular campaign or with a particular candidate in mind. And we saw this in Cleveland, Ohio with Senator Turner. It's absolutely necessary to be able to do some cleanup and voter education around issues like the voting for Biden is like eating half a bowl of SHIT comment, because at the end of the day, voters, Nina Turner was right, but voters have to be told what it is about Joe Biden that is like eating half a bowl of crap, right? They have to be told about his record. They have to be told about Biden and the crime bill. They have to be told about Biden being the person who makes it so that you can't discharge your student debt in bankruptcy, and on and on and on. It's the same case here. I am optimistic about these kinds of efforts popping up, but I hope there's a kind of on-the-ground, grassroots voter registration, door-knocking campaign that exists across the country, and not just targeted around getting any particular person out of office, but that has a longer tail on it, so the people who are living in these communities don't see it as this kind of self-interested carpetbagging campaign, but instead a locally invested group of human beings who wants the community to actually rise up to its full potential and will clear out the political obstacles in its way.
Briahna,
what's interesting about the Joe Manchin situation is, unlike Shontel Brown and Nina Turner, you saw how popular is Joe Manchin actually with the Democratic establishment? So with Shontel Brown, you saw the Democratic establishment come out and rally for her, whereas, they weren't for Nina Turner. They saw her as just another member that was going to come in and be like the squad. Joe Manchin, if he actually had somebody running against him, I'm really curious to see how the Democratic establishment would handle that. Would they say, oh, no, Joe Manchin's our guy? I mean, he's never been their guy. He's always delaying stuff. So it'll be interesting. Do they circle the wagons around him or not?
Their guy. He is their guy, though. Like in the sense that they're glad that they have him to give them the 50th vote. And sometimes they're glad that they can, pin things on him. We would love to do this, but old Joe Manchin just won't let us. It's a real shame. Briahna, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ryan.
And more rising after this.